So here's the question everybody asks me is, who should I ask? That's like a big question. There's lots of answers, lots of time we can spend on that question. So who should I ask? So we did clarify that earlier, Dr. Garner, we do agree that we think that research teachers are core teachers because it's a science class. We did talk in one of our sessions about core teachers. So I think that's a good place for us to start. So there's like kind of like, who should I ask in terms of like subject, and who should I ask in terms of relationship, and who should I ask in terms of like how I am in their class. And we'll kind of talk about some of those items. Okay, so who should you ask? I'm just going to say some things about the relationship part. So obviously it needs to be somebody that you have a relationship with. But when I say relationship, that doesn't necessarily mean that that has to be the person that you joke with the most, or it has to be the person that knows the most personal things about you. Now, it may be, but it may not be. So a relationship, in the sense of teacher recommendation, they can really speak to what kind of learner you are. They can speak to how you are when setbacks happen, how you handle hurdles. If you're in class and there's a project, and how you go above and beyond, or if you have a hurdle, how you work through that, how you contribute to class. So those are things to think of in terms of relationship with your teacher. All right, Garner.
So the whole point to a letter of recommendation is to make you look good, to say great things about you that aren't anywhere else in your application. So the letter of recommendation is not the grades you make, the attendance you have, or even things on your resume, because all of that is elsewhere. Mm-hmm. The letter of recommendation is a description of you, primarily how you are in a classroom setting. Secondarily is you as a person, because that's what colleges want to know. They see all this data in front of them, all these numbers, grades and GPAs and SAT scores and everything else, but they want something that describes you and how you behave and act and feel about your educational experience. That should be the number one concern when you get ready to ask someone to write about you. That it isn't, the person you ask isn't necessarily the person whose class you have 100 in all the time. Because if you find that 100 to be easy to obtain and you don't speak up much, they don't know you that well. They'll be able to write you a somewhat nice recommendation, but because they don't know you and they don't know what you struggle with, they don't know that you've overcome struggles, they don't know really who you are, that would not be a good person to ask. So you're probably thinking, well, who can I ask? You also need to consider the rules and guidelines of the colleges and scholarships, because some will specify, we only want a recommendation from an English teacher or a math teacher, or a math teacher and a science teacher, or a core academic teacher. So even though you may absolutely adore and have a great relationship with your athletic coach, who is a school employee, if that person has never been your teacher, that is not a good person to ask for those kinds of recommendations. Same thing with people like youth minister, Boy Scout leader, rec league coach, any of those things. Those are not the people to ask. And speaking of people to ask, if you have to go back to middle school to feel like someone's going to write you a good recommendation, then that says something to the admissions office, that you have to go back all the way to middle school. What it says is not very pleasant, because it says something must have happened pretty bad in high school that you didn't get any of your high school teachers to write you a recommendation. Having said all that, also understand that some colleges, not many these days, but some, depending on where you want to go, also allow you to submit supplemental letters of recommendation. So you know, for instance, they might require math and English, but then they also might allow a third supplemental letter, and that could be from anybody. And those people I just mentioned that you shouldn't ask, those would be good people to ask. So they're not completely out of the running, but you should absolutely ask your high school teachers first, primarily, without a doubt. That needs to be your high school teachers to write you letters of recommendation. We want to make you look good. We want to see you successful. We're not going to, if you ask us to write a letter of recommendation, if someone asks me and I feel like I can't write a glowing one for whatever reason, maybe I don't know you that well, maybe I just can't, for whatever reason, I'll tell you so that you have an opportunity to find somebody else who will write you a glowing letter of recommendation. And we will all be that way here at Magnet. We will never say, yes, we will, and then write you a bad one on purpose. Never. We will tell you no. And I know that's hard to hear because you just put yourself on the line. You're saying, please write about me, and somebody says no. That's difficult. It's difficult for us to say no. It's got to be difficult for you to hear no, but trust me, you do not want somebody saying yes and then writing you a mediocre recommendation, or even worse, a bad recommendation. So sometimes you're going to hear no, and that's going to be tough to take, but we're not going to sabotage you. We are not going to do anything to harm your success. In fact, we want you all to be successful. So if we cannot write you a great letter of recommendation, you might hear a no. So have some people in mind who you can ask.
So one of the things that Dr. Garner talked about, and it's actually kind of leads into my next question, he talked about the supplemental letters. If there's an option where it says you can submit an optional letter from somebody who's not your academic teacher. Okay, so if they don't ask for that, don't send it. So what you can't do is you actually can't send more than what they ask for. So there is a thing with following the instructions in the application. It does not look good to send in things that aren't asked. So the question that we always get asked is how many teachers to ask. I find if I just say a number typically ends up being 2. I will tell you that it depends on every college application. So you might find applications that don't require teacher letters at all. You might find that a college requires 2 and then a third optional. If you don't have an awesome third optional, then don't send in that third optional. If you have an awesome third optional, then take that opportunity. Mm-hmm. So how many to ask is really dependent on how you feel about the relationships you've built. You want the letters to be glowing. So it's definitely a situation where you want to follow instructions. You want to meet at least the minimum requirement, but you definitely want to do quantity over quality. So if there's one required, but you can submit two, but you feel like, you know what, I've got one awesome letter, and that's awesome. We're going to send out that one awesome letter. What some students, I have found in this process, some students do kind of panic when they hear us say that a teacher might say no and you do need to ask beforehand. So what some students have done is they've sent out 10 emails to everybody asking for a letter. And that is not what we want to do for lots of reasons. One, you might get 10 yeses, and it may be a huge waste of time for teachers because you can only use one or two. But you're also not really focusing on those relationships. The things that we were talking about earlier, like who's really going to be able to write about you in their classroom. And that's what we really want you to focus on. So this is a great time to have this conversation on a Friday and really think about it over the weekend. Some of you feel like you already know. Some of you have already asked. But really having that in-depth thought process with yourself of who you feel like will represent you well in the process. Okay, so that kind of leads into our question of how do you ask? So I have communicated with the teachers that you're going to ask through a formal email. And so I want to talk about this for a little bit. Obviously, if we were face-to-face, these would be face-to-face conversations. We aren't face-to-face, so that is what it is. Things that I would not want you to do is asking through social media or asking through text message or things like that. I think the best thing is for, I would say, a professional email to your teacher, asking them if they can write a letter. And Garner, I'll let you talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, you should absolutely ask first. You should also be aware that some colleges and scholarships have guidelines and rules. Generally, I write one letter of recommendation, and it serves pretty well for those students the whole year for whatever they need a recommendation for. But there are some things where they want specific items addressed, which means the person who's writing the letter recommendation will need time to adjust that letter to address those specific things. Many times you won't know that because you won't have access to the letter of recommendation page on whatever website you're using to get the scholarship or whatever. We need at least 2 weeks, at a minimum. 2 weeks, at a minimum.
At a minimum, especially, yeah, I would say at a minimum.
More is possible. Now, and for me personally, once I've written a letter of recommendation for you, and then you come to me in the spring and say, hey, this scholarship needs one, I can generally upload that same letter in a couple of days, no big deal. But to write it initially actually takes time, and to write a good one takes a couple of hours, maybe longer. And you want a good one. This is a lot of time that teachers spend on you, outside grades and planning and all that stuff. And you're worth it. We want you to be successful. Once you ask us through email, please then check your email. 4 years ago, I'm going to tell you a little story. 4 years ago, right before spring break, It was the Friday of spring break. That afternoon, I got an email from a senior saying, I meant to tell you in class, next Friday is the deadline for the scholarship I want. Can you please just submit the letter? And I had already written him one, so it was fine. I said, sure. In fact, right after I got the email, I went to the website for the scholarship, intending to upload it to be done with it. So I get there, and the scholarship wants a letter of recommendation that speaks entirely about the student's community service. I had no idea what this student's community service record was. Didn't have a clue. So I immediately emailed him back. Said, hey, give me some information. I need some more information from you so I can write a really good letter. Now, the deadline was in a week. That week was spring break. Never heard from him. We get back to school Monday after spring break, and he says, hey, thanks for writing me that letter of recommendation. And I said, yeah, I didn't, because I never heard back from you. They wanted these things, and you never responded, because he doesn't check his email. So he missed out on a scholarship simply because he didn't check his email. So when you send off these emails to teachers asking them, it is your responsibility to then check your email, because they might say no, they might say yes, but I need more information, or they might just say yes. You need to know what we say when we respond back to you. And the same thing goes with emailing colleges. You therefore need to check your email. Yes, I know, email is a pain. Yes, email is how old people communicate electronically. Yes, I know this. But guess what? That's who you're communicating with. So you got to use email. Sorry.
So I'm going to add to that just a quick story that I had. I received a text message on Thanksgiving while I was eating Thanksgiving dinner saying that, hey, I need you to send this counselor letter in 10 minutes. And it was on Thanksgiving. So these stories don't happen often, but why I'm telling you this is because we are absolutely here to support you. We're absolutely here to have your, support your application. Just make sure that you are communicating effectively, but right times in the right ways as well. Okay, so there's some questions in the chat box. Okay, awesome. Great questions, all things that we were planning on addressing. Okay, so what is the appropriate way of reminding teachers of deadlines? So I love that question. When I say a professional email, can anybody jump in and tell me what are some things that are included in professional emails? We often type in the chat box, what are some things that should be included in your email? A nice greeting. Yep. What else? Proper language. Yep. Your full name and intent in the subject. Cool. Introduction, acknowledgement. There's one thing that I personally don't love, and this might just be me, but the acronym ASAP. I think that the best way to handle it is in the email, tell the person when the deadline is. So say my deadline is September 25th, 2020. I think that's the best way to handle that instead of using the ASAP language. The other thing I would say is make sure, so there was a question of following up with your teachers, make sure that you give them